Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. I am so glad you are here tonight. Tonight we are going into a world that looks, on the surface, very familiar. We are going back to 1950s America. And if you have seen the photographs, and you probably have, the women in shirtwaist dresses, the men in suits, the gleaming new refrigerators, the broad green lawns, the perfectly identical houses stretching to the horizon. You already know what this era was supposed to look like. But tonight, we are not talking about what it was supposed to look like. Tonight, we are pulling back the cheerful yellow curtain on something people in the 1950s did not talk about at dinner parties, did not mention at church, and did not, under any circumstances, discuss with the neighbors. Tonight, we are talking about divorce. What it actually felt like in your body and in your chest to get one. What the law actually did to you. What your community actually said. What happened to your children, your money, your sense of yourself, and your ability to simply rent an apartment afterward. The 1950s is remembered as the golden age of the American family. And in many ways, the statistics do support that memory. Marriage rates were high, birth rates were soaring, suburban neighborhoods were growing faster than the grass could keep up with. But underneath all that cheerful post-war optimism, something else was also happening. People were getting divorced. Not in enormous numbers by today's standards, but in growing, quietly alarming numbers that made the magazines nervous and the clergy write long sermons. And for the people going through it, divorce in 1950s America was not a clean administrative process followed by a reasonable adjustment period. It was, for many people, one of the most bewildering, humiliating, financially devastating, and socially isolating experiences a human being could go through in the middle of the most prosperous decade in American history. So settle in. Let the story begin slowly and find you where you are. We have a long way to go tonight, and none of it needs to be rushed. You need to understand, first, the world that people were leaving behind when they decided to get divorced. Not just the legal world or the social world, but the physical, daily, sensory world of being married in 1950s America. You wake up in a house that belongs to both of you, though the mortgage is in his name. The house is probably small, a Cape Cod or a ranch-style bungalow, the kind that went up in the late 1940s and early 50s in clusters of 20 or 40 or 100 at a time, all sharing the same floor plan with the walls rearranged slightly so that you could tell them apart if you really squinted. The bedroom ceiling is low. There's wallpaper on the walls, probably something with small flowers or a geometric pattern, and it is already starting to pull away at the corners near the window because the house was built quickly and the pace was not quite right. The alarm clock on the nightstand is a round, cream-colored thing with two bells on top. It sits next to a glass of water and maybe a library book. The man in the bed beside you or across from you in the other twin bed, because many 1950s couples slept in separate beds, a fashion that would strike most modern people as both civilized and faintly melancholy, is already beginning to stir. This is the life. This is the thing you're either about to lose, or the thing you are about to escape. Possibly both, depending on the day and the hour and how well you slept. The 1950s is remembered as the decade when the American family reached its peak form. And there is genuine truth in that memory. The post-war economic boom had given millions of ordinary Americans access to things their parents could not have imagined. Suburban homeownership, reliable automobiles, electric washing machines, televisions, refrigerators large enough to hold a week's worth of groceries. The GI Bill had sent veterans to college. Wages were rising. The middle class was expanding. And marriage was, by nearly every available metric, the central organizing structure of American social life. In 1950, the median age at first marriage was 22 for men and 20 for women. Consider that for a moment. 20 years old. Many of these young women had never lived independently, never paid a utility bill, never negotiated a lease, never held a full-time job in their own names. They had gone from their parents' house to their husband's house, and that was simply what you did. That was the correct sequence of events. There was no alternate path that polite society recognized as valid. By the middle of the decade, about 96% of Americans who were old enough to marry had done so. The social pressure to be married was not subtle. It was not a gentle nudge. It was the entire architecture of daily life, built around the assumption that you were part of a couple headed by a man, housed in a home, raising children, attending church, and presenting yourself to the neighborhood as a complete and correct unit of American life. The popular culture was extremely enthusiastic about reinforcing this. Television programs like Ozzie and Harriet and Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver were not just entertainment. They were instruction manuals. They showed you in warm half-hour increments what a family was supposed to look like, how a wife was supposed to behave, what a husband was supposed to provide, and what constituted a problem worth mentioning, and what constituted a problem you simply absorbed quietly and did not speak of. Women's magazines, and there were many, including Good Housekeeping and Ladies' Home Journal and Better Homes and Gardens and McCall's, were relentless in their promotion of domestic contentment. The advertisements alone were a form of psychological reinforcement. A clean home meant a good wife. A good wife meant a happy husband. A happy husband meant a stable marriage. A stable marriage meant children who grew up correctly, and all of the elaborate machinery of domestic life ran on the quiet, uncompensated labor of women who were supposed to find it fulfilling because the magazine said they did. The sociologist Philip Wiley had already coined the term momism in the 1940s, arguing that American mothers had become too powerful and too smothering, a concern that was, to put it gently, somewhat misplaced given the actual conditions of women's lives. But it tells you something about the cultural anxiety of the era. Women were simultaneously being told that domesticity was their highest calling and their greatest joy, while also being blamed for doing it too enthusiastically. Into this world, the idea of divorce arrived like a brick through a picture window, noisy, unmistakable, and very difficult to explain to the neighbors. Here is something the 1950s preferred not to advertise too loudly. Divorce rates were rising, steadily, measurably, in ways that alarmed people who wrote for newspapers and people who preached from pulpits. At the end of World War II, in 1945 and 1946, there had been a spike in divorces so dramatic that it became impossible to ignore. Couples who had married quickly before soldiers shipped out, couples who had been separated for 3 or 4 years and had simply grown into different people, couples who had expected marriage to feel a certain way and discovered, upon actual cohabitation, that it felt considerably different. All of these people hit the courthouses at roughly the same time. In 1946, there were roughly 600,000 divorces in the United States, a record that would not be broken for 30 years. That wave subsided somewhat through the late 1940s and into the 50s, but it did not disappear. By the middle of the decade, about 1 in 4 marriages was ending in divorce. That ratio sounds almost quaint compared to what it would become in the 1970s and 80s. But in the context of 1955, when the public narrative was loudly insisting that the American family had never been stronger, 1 in 4 was a number that made everyone quietly uncomfortable. The people going through those divorces were not statistics, of course. They were people with specific living rooms and specific children and specific feelings about what had gone wrong and why. They were people who had to get up the next morning and face the exact same grocery store and the exact same church, and the exact same set of neighbors who had watched the whole thing happen from a polite distance. They were people who had to figure out, often with very little help and even less legal clarity, how to reorganize an entire life that had been built around the assumption that it would last forever, and they had to do it in an era that had very strong opinions about whether they should have done it at all. But the decision to divorce, the actual moment of it, the weeks leading up to it, the thing that happened in the chest when you finally said it out loud, that is where the story really begins. You are standing in the kitchen. It is 7:15 in the morning on a Tuesday in, say, 1953. The kitchen is small and bright, painted in a color that the hardware store called buttercup yellow. Though in this light, it looks more like the inside of an old envelope. The linoleum on the floor has a pattern of interlocking diamonds that you have memorized without meaning to. You could close your eyes and trace it. The percolator on the stove is doing its thing. That particular, very 1950s sound, a steady rhythmic gurgling that is almost calming if you are in the right mood, which you are not. The coffee will be ready in about 4 minutes. You know this because you have made this coffee approximately 900 times in the past 3 years. The children, if there are children, are not yet up, or they are up and getting themselves dressed with varying degrees of success, which you can track by the sounds from the upstairs hallway. The the thump of small feet, a drawer opening and closing, a brief disagreement about something that does not technically require your intervention yet. He is at the table with the newspaper. This is a very 1950s detail. The husband at the table with the newspaper, the wife at the stove. Not a caricature. Genuinely how millions of American mornings unfolded in this decade. The newspaper is the Chicago Tribune or the Los Angeles Times or the Cleveland Plain Dealer or whatever the local paper is. And he is reading it with the focused attention of a man who has not yet spoken to another human being this morning and does not particularly need to. You pour his coffee. You pour your own. You sit down across from him, or you do not sit down because there are lunches to make, or you half sit and half stand the way that women who are perpetually in the middle of tasks tend to occupy chairs. And here's the thing. There is nothing dramatic happening. There is no argument, no raised voices, no slammed doors. There is just a percolator and the newspaper and the buttercup yellow walls and the 900 mornings that came before this one, and the indefinite number of mornings that will follow. And somewhere in your chest, very quietly, like a tooth that has been sore for months and has finally started to truly ache, you have known for a while. This is not going to fix itself. This is a particular texture of an unhappy 1950s marriage in the weeks or months before something actually happens. Not violent necessarily. Not cruel in any dramatic way. Just empty or strained. Or mismatched in a way that was not visible from the outside, but was absolutely, unmistakably visible from inside the buttercup yellow kitchen at 7:15 in the morning. The reasons people's marriages were failing in the 1950s were, in their specifics, as varied as the people themselves. Some marriages have been entered into too young, too quickly, on the strength of wartime emotion and the social pressure to be paired up before the world ended. Some had run aground on the practical reality of two people who turned out to have fundamentally incompatible expectations of daily life. Some had been corroded by drinking. Alcoholism was widespread and significantly underreported in this era, frequently invisible behind the social ritual of cocktail hours and bar cabinets that every respectable 1950s home kept stocked as a matter of course. Some marriages have been damaged by infidelity. Some by financial strain, despite the decade's reputation for prosperity. Some simply by the slow, grinding work of two people who had stopped seeing each other. What was much rarer, at least in the official and documented record, was any systematic support for figuring out what to do next. Marriage counseling existed in some cities, offered through churches or through the handful of professional counselors who had begun setting up practices. But it carried its own stigma. The admission that your marriage needed professional help was itself an admission of failure. And for many couples, it was either financially out of reach or simply geographically unavailable. So people stayed, or they went. And when they went, the machinery that ground them through the process of leaving was unlike anything a modern person would recognize. But before any of that machinery, before the lawyers and the courtrooms and the judges and the social workers, there was a conversation that had to happen. The first conversation. The one where someone said it out loud. And that conversation, as it turned out, was only the beginning of a very long road. You have been thinking about it for a while. Maybe a few months. Maybe longer. The thought surfaces at odd moments. When you are hanging laundry on a line in the backyard. When you are driving the children to school. When you are lying in the dark at 2 in the morning listening to someone else breathe. It arrives without an appointment and sits down heavily and refuses to leave. The word for it, in 1953 or 1955 or 1958, is enormous, not in terms of length. It is a short word, a clean word, one syllable followed by two more, and it ends with a soft sound that almost feels like an exhale. But in terms of weight, it carries the mass of everything the 1950s thought about who you were supposed to be. Divorce. There it is. The first problem with wanting a divorce in 1950s America is that there is essentially no cultural permission slip for it. The permission slips that existed were narrow and specific and came with significant attached shame. You were allowed to want a divorce if your husband was violent. Even then, there was considerable social pressure to be patient, to be forgiving, to consider what the neighbors would think and what the children needed and what it would do to him to have his marriage fall apart. Physical violence was sometimes seen, by the prevailing social wisdom of the era, as a marriage problem to be worked through rather than a reason to leave. You were allowed to want a divorce if there had been infidelity, though even then the expectation was frequently that the wife would, after a suitable period of dignified suffering, choose to forgive and continue. The working assumption of many advice columnists and marriage counselors of the period was that the wife's response to her husband's affair said more about the strength of the marriage than the affair itself, which is a breathtaking piece of logic. And yet there it is in the popular press of the decade. You were not, by and large, culturally permitted to want a divorce because you were profoundly unhappy. You were not permitted to want one because you and your husband had grown so far apart that you felt like strangers who happened to share a refrigerator. You were not permitted to want one because you had realized, somewhere in your late 20s or early 30s, that the person you had married at 20 was not the person you were, or the person you needed, or the person who could make a life with you that felt like anything other than slow, polite suffocation. These were not grounds, not legally, not socially. They were problems to be managed, feelings to be examined by a qualified professional, dissatisfactions to be redirected into better homemaking or a new hobby, or a visit to the family doctor who would listen to your symptoms and prescribe something to take the edge off. The popular magazines were genuinely extraordinary in this period. In issue after issue, throughout the 1950s, the advice pages and the long features on marriage showed a consistent pattern. The problem was almost always located in the woman. If the marriage was struggling, it was because the wife had failed to keep herself attractive, failed to keep the house sufficiently pleasant, failed to be sufficiently appreciative of her husband's efforts, failed to manage the children correctly, or failed to submerge her own needs in a way that would make her husband feel properly supported. This was not fringe thinking. This was the mainstream. McCall's ran a famous campaign in 1954 around the concept of togetherness, the idea that the ideal American family was one in which husband and wife did everything as a unit, shared everything, wanted the same things at the same times. The magazine's editor described this as an evolution in family values. What it functioned as in practice was a very refined form of pressure on women to make their marriages work at essentially any cost. So there you are, at the kitchen table at 7:15 in the morning, or in the dark at 2 a.m., carrying the thought. And the question is not just whether to do it. The question is what doing it will actually cost you. And in 1950s America, that cost was very high, and it applied to almost every dimension of your life simultaneously. The financial cost, the social cost, the legal cost, the cost to your children, the cost to your sense of yourself, the cost of admitting, in a decade that had no patience for failure, that something had failed. Most people who have been through any version of this know that the decision period, the time between knowing and doing, is its own particular kind of suffering. The 1950s version of this suffering had all of the universal elements, and then several additional layers that were specific to the time, the law, and the culture. And the first additional layer arrived the moment you decided to do something about it and picked up the telephone to call a lawyer. The yellow pages of a 1950s American city are an artifact worth spending some time with. They are thick, printed on paper that yellows at the edges within a year or two, and organized with a confidence in alphabetical order that is genuinely comforting. Under attorneys, you'll find dozens of listings, often with small display advertisements that say things like general practice or family law or domestic matters handled with discretion. That last phrase is doing a lot of work. Domestic matters handled with discretion is the 1950s legal advertisement's way of saying, we know why you are calling. We have done this before. We will not make it worse than it has to be, and we will not tell anyone. It is aimed at women who are ashamed or afraid or both, which in 1950s America describes a significant portion of the people seeking divorces. You call the number. The phone is the kind that sits on a small table in the front hallway, because that is where phones lived in 1950s homes. On a dedicated phone table, often with a little upholstered seat attached, a furniture item that has essentially vanished from modern life. The handset is heavier than you expect and warm almost immediately in your palm. A secretary answers. She has a brisk, pleasant voice that gives nothing away. You give your name and explain that you are calling about a personal legal matter and would like to speak with an attorney about a family situation. There's a pause, and then an appointment is made. Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon. You put the phone down and stand in the hallway for a moment. The house is very quiet. The refrigerator hums from the kitchen. Outside, a car passes. Someone's dog barks twice and then stops. You have just done the thing. You have set it in motion. And now the hallway feels both exactly the same as it always has and completely different. The attorney's office, when you get there, is probably downtown in a building that has an elevator with an operator. It smells of pipe tobacco and old paper, and the carpet in the waiting room is a particular shade of dark green that 1950s professional offices seem to consider appropriately serious. A framed photograph of Eisenhower may or may not be on the wall, depending on the attorney's political leanings. A framed diploma from a law school almost certainly is the attorney himself, and it is almost certainly himself because in 1953, women represented fewer than 3% of all licensed attorneys in the United States, a statistic that is remarkable even by the standards of an era that was remarkable for this kind of thing. The attorney is probably in his 40s or 50s. He has the practiced, neutral expression of a man who has heard a great many things in this office that he has agreed never to repeat. He asks you to describe the situation. And here's the part that is genuinely strange by any modern standard. He asks you what grounds you have. Grounds. Not what happened, or why do you want to leave, or what is the nature of your difficulties. Grounds. Because in 1950s America, divorce law in virtually every state in the country required you to prove that your spouse had done something wrong. Divorce was not, legally speaking, something two people did because a marriage had ended. It was something a court did to a guilty party at the request of an innocent party. You were not both ending a marriage. You were accusing someone of wrongdoing. You were the plaintiff. Your spouse was a defendant, and the marriage was the crime scene. This system had been in place, in one form or another, since the earliest days of American law. It was rooted in English ecclesiastical tradition, in the theological concept that marriage was a covenant that could only be broken by specific and serious violations. The legal scholar Herbert Jacob, writing decades later, described the fault-based divorce system as a charade in which almost everyone pretended that something was true that generally was not. He was being generous. It was in practice a system that required people perform their personal failures in a specific and often legally scripted way, regardless of what had actually happened. The specific grounds available to you varied by state, but the most commonly accepted ones across most of the country included adultery, which was the most straightforwardly understood, desertion or abandonment, which typically requires a spouse to have left for a specified period, often 1 to 3 years, cruelty, which can mean physical cruelty or, in some states, mental cruelty, though the definition of mental cruelty was applied with wildly varying degrees of generosity, habitual, drunkenness, impotence, insanity, and in some states, conviction of a felony. What was notably and entirely absent from this list was, we grew apart. We are fundamentally incompatible. I am deeply unhappy. He is deeply unhappy. This marriage stopped working, and neither of us knows exactly why. These were not grounds. These were feelings. And the law, in 1950s America, was not in the business of feelings. The attorney explains all of this to you in the measured tone of someone delivering information that is simultaneously obvious to him and entirely new to you. He may be kind about it. He may be brisk. He may be slightly condescending in the way that many male professionals of this era were with female clients, not aggressively. Just as a matter of course, the way the entire professional structure of 1950s America was organized around the assumption that women needed things explained to them. He asks again, what grounds do you have? And now begins the particular moral and practical gymnastics that 1950s divorce proceedings required. This is where things get both legally fascinating and, depending on your mood, either quietly absurd or genuinely terrible or both simultaneously. In 1950s America, if you wanted a divorce and your spouse was not obviously guilty of any of the specific list of violations, you had a few options. You could wait years for a desertion to qualify. You could move to a state with more generous mental cruelty provisions. You could go to Nevada, or you could participate in what legal historians have called collusive divorce, the practice of fabricating, exaggerating, or mutually agreeing to stage the evidence required by the court. The most common form of this, in states where adultery was a primary or preferred grounds, was a staged adultery scene. This is exactly what it sounds like, and is even more extraordinary in practice. A husband who wished to cooperate with his wife's divorce proceedings, and many did, because they also wanted out or felt obligated to be the guilty party, because that was what the social code suggested, would hire a private room at a hotel or boarding house. He would invite a woman, often a friend of the couple or a woman who did this professionally and whose name sometimes circulated in legal circles, to be present in the room in a state of undress or partial undress. A private investigator would then arrive, also hired for the purpose, and would witness the scene. The investigator would then testify in court that he had observed the husband in an adulterous situation, which was technically true in the sense that the scene had occurred, though the adulterer itself had not. The wife's attorney presented this testimony. The judge, who almost certainly understood exactly what he was hearing, accepted it. The divorce was granted. Everyone involved had technically complied with the law while completely subverting its intended meaning, and nobody discussed this afterward. This practice was so common in New York, which had among the most restrictive divorce laws in the country, that it had become a minor industry by the 1950s. New York's only recognized grounds for divorce was adultery, singular, with no alternative, which meant that virtually every uncontested divorce in the state required either genuine adultery or performed adultery, or some creative attorney's interpretation of what the word could mean. The New York hotel business, in this particular period, was inadvertently structured to accommodate this need. Hotel detectives knew what to look for. Judges knew what they were being told. And the charade rolled on decade after decade, until it finally collapsed under its own weight in the 1960s. In states that allowed cruelty as grounds, the situation was somewhat less theatrical, but no less scripted. Mental cruelty, once accepted as a legal concept, became extraordinarily elastic. It could mean genuine psychological abuse, sustained belittlement, threats, manipulation. It could also mean persistent neglect, habitual coldness, a refusal to maintain any kind of intimate or communicative relationship. In practice, it frequently meant the attorney writing a statement that described the general unhappiness of the marriage using specific legally colored language, and the client swearing that this statement reflected her experience, which it usually did in essence, if not always in precise detail. The testimony required in court for mental cruelty claims was both standardized and, from the modern perspective, rather poignant. Women sitting in the witness box of American courtrooms throughout the 1950s described, in language coached by their attorneys, how their husbands had ignored them, embarrassed them, criticized them, refused to speak to them for extended periods, displayed persistent hostility, made them feel humiliated or worthless. Sometimes this was a precise account of what had actually happened. Sometimes it was a reasonable approximation. The women delivered these accounts in front of judges and court reporters, and if the husband had agreed not to contest proceedings, the judge would nod and a decree would be issued. What was almost never said, in any official court record of the period, was the actual reason for the divorce as the couple understood it. The actual reasons: incompatibility, exhaustion, quiet despair, the slow accumulation of disappointments that eventually becomes too heavy to carry. These lived in conversations that happened in attorneys' offices and in kitchen arguments at 11 at night, and in letters that people burned because there was no point in keeping them. The official record was a legal document that bore only a partial and formal relationship to the truth. The attorney across the desk in the green carpeted office knows all of this. And if he is a good attorney, and if you cannot produce convincing evidence of any of the listed grounds, he will explain your options. Some attorneys were genuinely helpful in this regard, practical, unsentimental guides through a system they had long since stopped pretending was rational. Others were less so. What all of them would eventually bring up, if the situation called for it, was Nevada. Imagine, for a moment, that you are standing on a street in Reno, Nevada, in the summer of 1952. The air is dry and hot in a way that feels fundamental, like the air itself has decided that moisture is not its area of expertise. The mountains are visible to the west, the Sierra Nevada rising in a jagged, violet-gray line against a sky so blue it seems almost aggressive about it. Downtown Reno is a modest place by the standards of what would eventually become a town of casinos and wedding chapels and lawyers' offices and boarding houses, all of which exist in various degrees of mutually dependent relationship. The boarding houses are particularly important to understand. Because Reno, in 1952, was in the middle of a decades-long run as the undisputed divorce capital of the United States, a position it held with a combination of legal practicality and genuine civic pride that was, depending on your perspective, either refreshingly unsentimental or faintly alarming. The arrangement worked like this. Nevada had a residency requirement of 6 weeks. 6 weeks. If you lived in Nevada for 6 weeks, you were a legal resident of Nevada, and Nevada had both more relaxed grounds for divorce and a court system that processed cases efficiently, professionally, and without excessive moral judgment. You arrived, established residence, waited the required period, appeared in court, said what needed to be said, received your decree, and went home. The boarding houses and small ranches around Reno had figured this out very quickly and had organized themselves accordingly. There were establishments, some of them quite comfortable, even pleasant, that catered specifically to what Reno residents and the national press, with equal parts amusement and bemusement, called divorce seekers. These were mostly women, because the social logic of the era suggested that the husband should usually be the one to remain in the family home while the wife sought the legal exit. The women arrived by train or by airplane, or occasionally by car, carrying a suitcase and a letter from their attorney, and a return ticket they were not entirely certain they would use on the intended date. The experience of waiting in Reno for 6 weeks was, by many accounts, a peculiar blend of holiday and purgatory. You were somewhere beautiful and unfamiliar, with no domestic responsibilities, and no social obligations, and no neighbors who knew your name. You could ride horses, which many of the Reno ranches offered as an activity specifically because it was something to do for 6 weeks. You could gamble, which Nevada permitted, and which provided a useful metaphor about chance and risk that nobody in Reno during this period had the energy to make. You could have dinner with the other women who were waiting out the same period, a group that could be remarkably varied, housewives from Ohio and socialites from New York and school teachers from Georgia, and the occasional woman who said very little about where she was from or why she was there. Some of the Reno boarding house owners became minor celebrities in their own right. Women like Corinne Curry, who ran a guest ranch outside Reno, became known for creating an environment that was genuinely supportive of women going through a process, comfortable, discreet, with good food and sensible advice and horses that were neither too fast nor too slow. These women had heard every story there was to hear, and they were, by most accounts, extraordinary listeners. The journey to Reno was itself a kind of social declaration, because the destination was not a secret. Reno had been the subject of enough newspaper stories and magazine features, and even films that its purpose was universally understood. If someone in your social circle in Cleveland or Cincinnati or Memphis mentioned that her aunt was visiting out west for a few weeks, there was a reasonable chance that the aunt was in Reno. If a woman appeared on a train to Nevada, without visible luggage for a ski trip or family connection, the conductor had probably made a reasonable inference by the second stop. This meant that the decision to go to Reno was not a private one. The very act of going was a form of public statement, which is why some women arranged their trips with considerable care for the geography of their departure, leaving from a train station in a neighboring city, telling relatives they were visiting a friend rather than traveling west, avoiding any situation where they might be seen by someone who would report back to the neighborhood. The cost of a Reno divorce, when you factored in 6 weeks of lodging, meals, entertainment, transportation, and legal fees, was not trivial. It ran to several $100s at minimum, which in the early 1950s represented weeks or months of a working man's wages. This meant that Reno divorces were, in practice, available primarily to women whose families had money or whose husbands had agreed to pay the costs. Women without financial resources, which, as we will come to shortly, was a majority of married women in this era, frequently had no access to the Nevada option at all. The attorneys who handled Reno divorce cases had a particularly streamlined practice. The 6-week residency established, the filing completed, the brief court appearance scheduled, the decree issued. A Reno divorce court of the 1950s was a busy, business-like place, not cold but efficient. Judges were familiar with the general outlines of the cases before them. Attorneys knew exactly how to present the required elements. The women who appear in court had been prepared by their lawyers for what questions they would be asked and what answers were legally appropriate. The questioning typically took about 15 minutes. The judge asked whether you had been a resident of Nevada for the required period, whether there were children involved, and what arrangements had been made for them, and whether the listed grounds, almost always cruelty in Nevada, which was accepted broadly enough to encompass most unhappy marriages, were accurate to your experience. You said yes. The judge signed the decree. You stepped out into the dry Nevada air, and your marriage was over. Nevada was eventually joined by other states in offering relatively accessible divorce, though never quite with the same cultural cachet. Arkansas had a 3-month residency requirement that attracted some petitioners. Idaho was occasionally mentioned, but Reno remained the byword throughout the 1950s, the place whose name alone communicated what it meant, the way that certain place names acquire a secondary meaning so powerful that they temporarily eclipse the geography entirely. The social commentary about Reno was extensive and largely unkind. The phrase Reno divorce was used by newspapers and magazines with a tone that ranged from amused to disapproving, and the women who went there were described in terms that oscillated between sympathetic and judgmental depending on the publication's readership and the editor's personal feelings about marriage. Women's magazines that were otherwise supportive of female readers were frequently ambivalent about the Reno phenomenon, aware that their readers might need it, uncertain about publicly endorsing it. But the Reno option at least existed, and for the women who could reach it, it provided something that most states in the country did not: a relatively quick, relatively clean exit from a marriage that had stopped working, without requiring either an elaborate legal performance or years of waiting. For the women who could not reach it, or who chose not to, what came next was a courtroom. Between deciding to get divorced and actually being divorced, there was a period that nobody ever talks about, but that everyone who lived through it remembers with a particular sharpness: the waiting period. In most states, after the petition for divorce was filed and served on the spouse, there was a mandatory waiting period before anything else could happen. This ranged from a few months to over a year, depending on the state. The waiting period was designed, according to the official reasoning, to give couples time to reconsider, to cool down, to return to reason. The assumption embedded in this legal requirement was that divorce was usually the product of temporary emotional disorder rather than sustained and considered judgment, and that a few months of quiet reflection would restore people to their senses. For many people, what the waiting period actually produced was an extended period of living in limbo. You were still legally married. You might still be living in the same house, because there was nowhere else to go and no money to go there, and the children needed stability, and leaving the family home raised its own legal complications. You might have arranged a kind of civil domestic coexistence, separate lives and shared space, the ghost of marriage still inhabiting the rooms. Or you might have been the one who left, which usually meant moving in with your parents, if they lived nearby, and if they were willing, which introduced its own particular texture of difficulty. Coming home at 32 with 2 children, and a suitcase to sleep in a room where you had slept at 16. The room perhaps still with the same curtains, the same vanity mirror, the same view of the same backyard, was an experience that occupied a strange emotional register somewhere between relief and defeat. The social calendar during the waiting period underwent a fundamental reorganization. Couples who had socialized together had to figure out what happened to their friends now. The answer usually was that the friends sorted themselves, some to his side, some to hers, some attempting an impossible neutrality that usually collapsed within a few months. Dinner parties that had previously featured both of you were now navigated without one or both. The school events of the children required a careful choreography of arrivals and departures to minimize the exposure of the situation to people who had not yet been told. Letters had to be written to the in-laws if the relationship warranted it, to mutual friends who deserved to hear from you directly rather than through the telephone network of neighborhood gossip, to anyone who might reasonably be startled to hear from someone else that your marriage was ending. Writing these letters, in the actual physical sense, pen to paper, the slight pressure required to form each word, the way you had to consider every sentence before committing it to page, was its own experience. You could not delete a sentence in a 1950s letter. You wrote what you meant, or you scratched it out and wrote something else. And either way, the effort of the thing was visible. And through all of it, the ordinary mechanisms of life continued. Groceries needed to be purchased. Children needed to be fed and clothed and walked to school. Laundry piled up and was dealt with. The neighbor's dog came through the gap in the fence again and needed to be returned. The newspaper arrived. The mail arrived. The refrigerator made a new sound that might or might not be a problem. Life, in other words, did not pause the process of dissolving a marriage. It kept going at its same relentless pace, and you had to keep going with it, even on the days when keeping going felt like an act of sheer will. And eventually, the waiting ended, and you went to court. The courthouse is a building with ambitions. Most American county courthouses of the 1950s are substantial stone or brick structures from an earlier century, built in the period when civic architecture was expected to communicate permanence and authority in the manner of bank or church. The stone steps are worn in the middle from decades of feet. The brass handles on the doors are polished but cool to the touch. Inside, the ceilings are high and the floors are marble or dark wood, and the air smells of something that is not quite dust and not quite old paper, but somewhere in between. You arrive with your attorney. You are wearing something appropriate, a suit or a neat dress, gloves if it is that kind of proceeding in that kind of court. Nothing too bright because the social codes around courtroom dress in the 1950s leaned toward conservative and subdued, as if cheerful colors might imply insufficient gravity about the proceedings. Your hair is done. You look, from the outside, composed. From the inside, the precise opposite may be true. The divorce courtroom is smaller than you might expect. The public perception of divorce proceedings, shaped partly by films and partly by newspaper accounts of more dramatic cases, involves a full courtroom with observers and drama. The ordinary, uncontested divorce in 1950s America was considerably more intimate. A judge, a court reporter, your attorney, possibly your spouse's attorney, and you, sometimes your spouse, sometimes not, if the divorce was truly uncontested and both parties had already signed the necessary agreements. The judge is almost certainly a man. He is probably the generation that fought in or presided over home front during World War II, a generation that had its own ideas about marriage and duty and what women were and were not capable of managing. He may be sympathetic. He may be businesslike. He may be slightly avuncular in a way that suggests he is trying to be kind, but is uncertain exactly how to be kind to a woman in this situation. Your attorney leads you through the testimony. He asks you the questions. You answer them. The answers are, as we have already discussed, the answers that are legally required rather than necessarily the answers that are most true. You describe the cruelty or the abandonment or the intemperance in the language the law recognizes. The court reporter's fingers move steadily over the keys of the stenography machine. The judge watches you with an expression that is professionally neutral. If your spouse is present and uncontesting, they may be asked a few questions of their own. If they are absent, your attorney has already handled whatever arrangements were necessary. And this part is both the simplest and in some ways the strangest part of the whole process. The judge says a few words and signs a piece of paper. And that is it, or almost it, in many states. What you have received at this point is an interlocutory decree, a preliminary order, not yet a final divorce. You are not yet remarriageable. You must wait another 6 months to a year, in most states, before the divorce is absolute and final. This additional waiting period was also designed, theoretically, for reconciliation. In practice, it extended the limbo and generated additional attorney fees. But you walk out of the courthouse into the daylight. The stone steps are still worn in the middle. The brass handles are still cool. The air outside smells like nothing in particular. Automobile exhaust and grass from somewhere and the faint possibility of rain. You stand on the courthouse steps for a moment. Your attorney says something practical about next steps and paperwork. You nod. The whole thing has taken less time than you expected, which is both a relief and somehow strange, because it has not taken less time at all. It has taken everything that led up to this moment, every difficult morning and sleepless night, and letter written and telephone call made. The courtroom was just the punctuation at the end of a sentence that started a very long time ago. And now you have to figure out what comes after the punctuation. Here is the thing about privacy in a 1950s American suburb. It does not really exist. Not in the malicious sense. Not necessarily. But the physical design of suburban life in this decade created an involuntary transparency that has no real modern equivalent. The houses are close together on modest lots. The backyards are separated by low chain link fences or nothing at all. The kitchen windows look out onto each other. The driveways are shared or nearly shared. The mailboxes are visible from the street. You know when your neighbor is home because you can see their car. You know when they have company because you can see the extra cars. You know, roughly, when they eat dinner because the kitchen light is on. You know when there is a problem because a pattern that has been stable for years suddenly changes. They know. That is a thing you come to understand very early in the process. If you did not know it already, the neighborhood knows. Maybe not the specifics. Maybe not the exact grounds listed in the petition. Maybe not the details of the arrangement regarding the children. But the fact of it, yes, the fact has been visible for some time. If you think about it honestly, the change pattern of his car being there and not being there. The children being walked to school by the grandmother. The lights in the house burning until midnight on weeknights. People notice these things, not because they're trying to, but because the physical closeness of suburban life makes noticing essentially unavoidable. The question is what they do with what they notice. The 1950s American neighbor, as a social type, had a highly developed protocol for the situation. The protocol was called not saying anything, not directly. The neighbor did not come to the door and say, "I noticed that Bob's car hasn't been here in 3 weeks. Is everything all right?" The neighbor might, instead, come to the door with a casserole. The casserole was a food delivery system that doubled as a form of social acknowledgement, the culinary equivalent of a gentle hand on the shoulder, which said, "I know something has happened. I'm not going to make you talk about it. Here is a tuna noodle dish that will keep for several days in the refrigerator." Casseroles were followed, after a respectful interval, by quiet conversations at the fence or on the driveway, conversations that began on neutral subjects. The children, the weather, the new family that had moved in at the end of the block, and might gradually, over several encounters, move towards something more direct, or might not. Some neighborhoods operated for months on the energy of knowing without saying, a collective social performance of near-perfect discretion that was both remarkably kind and slightly suffocating. The church was a different matter. In 1950s America, church membership was extremely high by the standards of what it would later become. Roughly 95% of Americans identified as Christians, and a substantial proportion of them attended services regularly and organized significant portions of their social lives around their congregation. The church was where you knew people, where your children went to Sunday school, where the women's auxiliary met on Tuesday mornings, where you had been married. And the church had, in most denominations, very specific and very strongly held views about divorce. The Catholic Church's position was the most categorical. Divorce was not recognized. A valid sacramental marriage could not be dissolved by civil law. If you were Catholic and obtained a civil divorce, you remained married in the eyes of the church and were prohibited from receiving the sacraments while in a state of what the church considered an irregular domestic arrangement. The only church-sanctioned path out of marriage was an annulment, which required demonstrating that the marriage had never been truly valid, that it had been entered into without full consent or under duress, or with some fundamental impediment that prevented the sacrament from taking effect. Annulments were technically available, but were neither quick nor easy, and not every situation qualified. For Catholic women who obtained civil divorces in the 1950s, and many did, the aftermath within the church community was complicated and often painful. You might continue to attend Mass, which the church allowed, while being unable to participate in communion. You might feel, in the community of your parish, a shift in how you were regarded. Not always hostile, but marked. You had done something that the theology of your community said was not possible, and you were now in a category that had no comfortable home. The Protestant denominations varied considerably. Most mainstream Protestant churches, Methodist, Presbyterian, Baptist, Lutheran, officially discouraged divorce, while acknowledging that it sometimes occurred and leaving the pastoral response somewhat to the discretion of individual clergy. A compassionate pastor might be genuinely supportive of a member going through divorce, particularly if the circumstances involve clear wrongdoing by a spouse. A less compassionate one might offer judgment dressed in the language of concern. The range was wide. What was consistent across nearly all religious communities of the 1950s was the social weight of church membership as a lens through which divorce was interpreted. The congregation was a community of people who shared a moral framework, and that framework, In almost every Protestant and Catholic tradition of the era, held that marriage was sacred, permanent, and not to be set aside casually. Whether or not individuals in the congregation said anything directly to you, you were aware of being seen through that lens. Some women left their congregations after divorce and either joined a different church that felt more welcoming or simply stopped attending for a period. Some stayed and found that the community, over time, was more adaptive than the official theology suggested. And some discovered that the women of their church were, privately and individually, considerably more understanding than the institution itself, because the women of any congregation in any decade include a surprising number of people who have personal reasons to understand difficulty. The official record of what church communities said about divorced women in this decade is considerably harsher than the actual texture of individual human kindness. Both things were true simultaneously. Institutions and individuals did not always behave the same way, even when they shared the same name. But the institutional weight was real, and it was one of the several heavy things you were now carrying. Let us talk about property. Let us talk about money. Let us talk about the financial reality of a 1950s American divorce in the specific and unbeautiful terms that it actually existed in. You have been married for 6 years or 10 years or 12. During those years, money came into the household from his salary, almost certainly, because in the 1950s, a dominant domestic arrangement involved a husband who worked outside the home and a wife who did not, or who worked part-time in a role that was understood to be secondary and supplemental. Roughly 80% of married women with young children were full-time homemakers during this decade. Their labor, the cooking, the cleaning, the childcare, the shopping, the social management of the household, the invisible maintenance of every system that kept a family functioning, was understood to be valuable in a moral and emotional sense, but was not, legally or financially, treated as an economic contribution to the marital estate. This meant that when the marriage ended, the question of who got what was shaped almost entirely by whose name was on what, and whose name was on what was almost entirely the husband's name. The house, if there was one, was in his name. The mortgage was in his name. The car, probably the better car, if there were two, and in 1950s America, two-car households were becoming more common but were not yet standard, was in his name. The savings account was in his name, or in both names, but effectively under his control, because he was the one who had been earning and depositing the money. The checking account was probably in both names, but again, primarily funded by his income. If you had a bank account in your own name, and many married women did not, operating entirely through the joint account or through cash given them by their husbands for household expenses, the balance in it was likely modest. Money given to you for groceries or household management was not savings. It was operating budget. The laws governing marital property in 1950s America were a patchwork that varied significantly by state, but in most states they followed what was called a common law property system, which held that property belonged to whoever had purchased or earned it. Since the husband had purchased or earned almost everything, the husband owned almost everything. A wife's claim to marital property was effectively a claim on the goodwill of her husband or the discretion of the judge. Alimony, payments made by a former husband to a former wife after divorce, existed and was theoretically available. In practice, it was granted inconsistently and was often inadequate. The amount was typically calculated in relation to the husband's income, set by the judge based on a combination of the established standard of living, the wife's apparent needs, and the husband's ability to pay. There was no formula, no guarantee, and no reliable mechanism for enforcement if payments stopped. Enforcement was, in fact, one of the most acute practical problems of divorce in this era. If your former husband decided, for whatever reason, to stop sending the alimony check, because he had remarried, because he had lost his job, because he had relocated to a different state, because he had simply decided that he did not feel like continuing, your options for compelling payment were limited and expensive. You could return to court, which required another attorney, and another filing fee, and another wait. You could hire someone to track him down, which cost money you did not have. Or you could write letters that went unanswered and telephone calls that were not returned and simply absorb the shortfall as best you could. Many women absorbed the shortfall. Child support existed on similarly shaky legal ground. The principle that fathers were financially responsible for their children's care was clear in theory. The machinery for enforcing that responsibility was inadequate in practice. The legal scholar Harry Krauss, writing in the 1960s about the family law system he had watched operate throughout the previous decade, described child support enforcement in the United States as a national disgrace. He was not overstating it. So the financial landscape of divorce in 1950s America looked something like this. The woman leaving the marriage had, typically, no independent credit history, because credit in the 1950s was not issued to married women in their own names as a matter of routine banking practice. It was issued to the household, meaning the husband. She had no property in her name. She had, possibly, a few $100s in a personal account and whatever cash she had set aside. She had children who needed to be housed and fed and clothed and educated, and a child support arrangement that might or might not be honored. And she had, if she was lucky, an alimony arrangement that might or might not continue. Into this financial reality, she was now expected to reconstruct a functioning life. The sheer practical impossibility of this, which we will get to in more detail shortly, was not invisible to the people of the 1950s. It was discussed in magazine articles, in legal journals, in the occasional book on the subject of divorce and its social consequences. But the discussion was largely framed around the problem of divorced women as a social welfare concern, or as a question of legal reform that was clearly needed but somehow never quite arrived at the top of the legislative agenda, rather than as a fundamental structural failure of the way society organized women's economic dependence. The toaster, since we mentioned it, the toaster was almost certainly yours. Small household items, the kitchen equipment, the children's furniture, the curtains, these tended to go with the woman, and children if she was the one leaving. The larger assets, the house, the car, the savings, these were considerably more contested and considerably more likely to remain in the husband's sphere. You stood in the kitchen of a house that you had lived in for years and looked at the objects that compose your domestic life and tried to figure out which of them you were taking with you. It was a different kind of reckoning than anything that had come before. It was a reckoning of what all of it, in the end, had actually added up to. It is evening. Specifically, it is that hour in the late afternoon that slips into early evening, the hour when a married life dinner would have been starting to happen. The stove going, the children coming in from outside, the particular domestic noise of a household beginning its wind-down sequence. But tonight, this night, the first night, or one of the early nights, you are somewhere else. Maybe a room in your parents' house. The childhood bedroom with the same view through the same window. The backyard you grew up in visible in the fading light. Maybe a rented furnished room somewhere, with someone else's furniture and someone else's curtains and a shared bathroom at the end of the hallway. Maybe a friend's spare room, which smells like her children's shampoo and has a pull-out sofa that is more comfortable than expected. The children are not here tonight. They are with him, or with your mother, or in the room next door, asleep already. Or they are here, and you have put them to bed, and now you are alone in whatever space you are occupying, and the silence is a specific, very loud silence of a life that has reorganized itself around a fundamental subtraction. You sit down, or you stand by the window. The light outside is doing what light does in early evening, going golden and long and slightly too beautiful for the moment, which is a light's complete indifference to your circumstances. What you feel, the accounts left by women who went through divorce in this era, in diaries, in letters, in oral histories that sociologists began collecting in later decades, in occasional memoir, describe a complicated mixture that does not resolve neatly into either relief or grief. Both were usually present. So it was something harder to name, a kind of vertiginous awareness of open space, as though the structures that had been holding your life in a specific shape had been removed, and you were experiencing, for the first time in years, the full unmediated weight of your own existence. Some women described this as terrifying. Some described it as something closer to a terrible, guilty freedom. Some described it as nothing, a numbness that they knew, intellectually, would eventually give way to something else, but had not yet. The phone might ring, or it might not. You might call someone, your closest friend, your sister, your mother, or you might not be ready for that yet. For the particular way that someone who loves you can make you cry when you've been managing to not cry for several days. You eat something, or you do not. There is food, or there is not. You have been managing the logistics of moving and legal proceedings and children for weeks, and the refrigerator might contain the carefully practical provisions of someone who's been thinking ahead, or it might contain almost nothing, because thinking ahead about groceries has temporarily exceeded your available capacity. The radio is on, or the television is on. The television, by the mid-1950s, was in most American living rooms, a large piece of furniture with a small screen that showed programming that began in the afternoon and ended around 11 at night with a test pattern. The programming that greeted you in the evening was almost certainly a family sitcom of some kind, Ozzie and Harriet, or Father Knows Best, or I Love Lucy, all of them organized around the premise of marriage that worked, however comedically. The irony of this is a particular 1950s version of the universe having a very dry sense of humor. You might turn it off. You might leave it on for the company of voices. You might sit in front of it without watching it. The faces of actors moving across the screen while your mind is entirely elsewhere. Outside, your former life is continuing. Somewhere he is in the house. The children, if they are with him tonight, are sleeping in their own beds. The neighborhood is quiet in a way that neighborhoods are quiet after 9. The television glow from other windows. A dog somewhere. The occasional car. Tomorrow you will begin the process of building the structure of the next version of your life. You will make phone calls. You will look at budgets. You will figure out the practical things. But tonight, the first night or the early nights, belongs to the weight of what has actually happened and the particular stillness of a life between its shapes. And then, in the morning, one of the most immediate and pressing practical problems arrives. Where are you going to live? You need an apartment. This sounds like a simple sentence. It is not a simple sentence in 1955 America for a woman who has just been divorced, has children, has limited income, and has no credit history in her own name. Begin with the credit history. In the 1950s, credit, in the form of installment loans, bank loans, or the charge accounts that some department stores and retailers offered, was routinely denied to married women in their own right, and was essentially unavailable to single women, including divorced women, as a practical matter. The legal framework supporting this was elaborate and largely invisible to most people experiencing it. Banks made credit decisions on the basis of income and credit history, and divorced women generally lacked both in the form that the banking system recognized as valid. The credit card, as a general consumer product, was still in its early stages. Diners Club had introduced a charge card in 1950, and American Express followed later in the decade. But these were aimed primarily at businessmen. The use case was literally described as being for the traveling businessman, and women were rarely the primary cardholder. The broader credit card ecosystem that would eventually, in later decades, provide one pathway to independent credit building did not yet exist in the form that made it accessible to ordinary divorced women. This meant that if you needed to sign a lease on an apartment, you often could not do so on your own financial strength. Landlords wanted to see income. Divorced women frequently had no independent income, or had income, alimony, or child support, that landlords were skeptical of, for the reasonable if unkind reason that alimony and child support were often unreliable. Some landlords required a male cosigner. Some simply declined to rent to divorced women with children, on the grounds that children caused damage to property, or that a single-mother household represented an undesirable tendency in ways that were rarely stated directly, but were perfectly clear. The housing discrimination against divorced women in this era was neither illegal nor, in most quarters, considered particularly wrong. It was simply the practical operation of the rental market, which was a private market operated by private individuals who were free to rent to whom they chose. Some cities had fair housing advocates and reformers who were beginning to push back against discrimination in housing markets, primarily focused on racial discrimination, which was both far more severe and somewhat more visible. The subtler discrimination against divorced women and single mothers was largely off the reform agenda. So where did you go? The options were fairly specific. You went back to your parents, if they were living and nearby and willing. This was the most common option for women with children, particularly in the early months following a divorce. The parent house offered immediate stability, shared childcare, no lease required, and a kitchen you were familiar with. It also offered, as we have mentioned, the particular experience of being an adult woman of 30 or 32 living in the bedroom of your 15-year-old self, which was an experience that had its own very specific emotional profile. You found a rooming house or boarding house that would accept you. These establishments, which had been far more common earlier in the century, were still operating in many American cities in the 1950s. Older houses that had been converted to multiple rented rooms, usually with shared bathrooms and sometimes shared kitchen facilities. They were the solution for people who were between things, between marriages, between jobs, between cities. They were also, by the social standard of the 50s, somewhat déclassé, associated with a kind of transience that the decade did not regard admiringly. Moving into a boarding house was an acknowledgement of impermanence, of not yet having landed somewhere. You found a furnished apartment. These are more available than unfurnished, and the furniture already present meant you did not need to have furniture of your own, which you might not. Furnished apartments tended to be smaller and slightly run down, because the furniture they were furnished with was usually the furniture nobody else had wanted, mismatched, and tired. But they were available with shorter lease terms, and sometimes with landlords who were more flexible about the income and credit requirements, simply because a furnished apartment at $45 a month attracted a specific kind of tenant, and the landlord knew it. You found a sympathetic landlord. These existed, not universally and not reliably, but they existed. People for whom the transaction of renting an apartment was also a human relationship. People who could look at a woman with 2 children and a reasonable story and a sincere willingness to pay on time and make a judgment that the situation was manageable. Neighbors in new apartments could be remarkably tolerant of the sounds of children when they had been prepared to expect them. Some women, particularly in larger cities like New York or Chicago or Los Angeles, found their way into buildings or neighborhoods where a form of informal community had developed among divorced and single women. Not organized, not announced, but real. A building where the woman in the apartment across the hall was also recently divorced and had a daughter, and where the building manager had become accustomed to this kind of tenant and was no longer surprised by them. These informal networks of mutually sustaining women were one of the practical adaptations to a world that had not designed its systems to accommodate them. The apartment that you ended up in, whatever it was and wherever it was smaller than the house. The rooms were lower and the walls were thinner, and the kitchen was a galley that required a specific choreography to use if more than one person was in it at once. The children's bedroom, if there was a dedicated children's bedroom, involved some creative interpretation of what a child's bedroom needed to contain. The living room was small enough that the sofa and the television and the armchair accounted for most of the available floor space. But it was yours, your name on the lease, or as much of your name as the landlord had been willing to put on it. Your key, your kettle on the stove, your books on the shelf, or the shelf that the children had covered in drawings that you had taped up because the walls were very white and needed something on them. It was a beginning, not a comfortable one, but a beginning. Now let us talk about what it meant to need money in 1955 America as a divorced woman with children. The majority of married women in the 1950s had not been maintaining careers during their marriages. The social expectation was explicit. A woman who needed to work after marriage was advertising, however quietly, that her husband did not earn enough to support the family, which was an embarrassment to him and a social stigma to her. Women who worked during marriage often stopped when children arrived, because childcare was an individual family responsibility, and the infrastructure of professional or public childcare that later generations would take for granted simply did not exist in the form needed. So the woman seeking employment after divorce was often doing so from a position of having been out of the workforce for 3, 5, 8, 12 years. She might have worked before marriage as a secretary, a nurse, a teacher, a department store clerk, any of the range of occupations that were socially and professionally acceptable for women before marriage. Those skills had not necessarily kept pace with the workplace she was returning to. The specific knowledge, the office procedures, the equipment, the organizational cultures had shifted in her absence. The job market for women in 1950s America was also, by any modern standard, dramatically constrained. Women's employment was concentrated in a fairly narrow range of occupations: clerical work, teaching, nursing, domestic service, retail, waitressing. Professional careers were available to women, but required credentials and persistence in the face of gatekeeping that the era made extremely efficient. Law, medicine, engineering, architecture, finance. These fields had women in them, but in small numbers and typically against significant resistance. The pay differential between men and women doing comparable work was substantial and openly acknowledged. Women working as secretaries or clerks or nurses were paid considerably less than men doing equivalent work, on the entirely circular reasoning that men had families to support and women did not. A reasoning that the divorced woman trying to support 2 children on her salary found particularly interesting. The secretarial pool of the 1950s American office was the single most significant employment destination for women returning to work after divorce. It was accessible. It was consistent with the skills most women of that generation had been encouraged to develop before marriage, and it paid enough to be a partial solution if supplemented by other income. The office was also, for better or worse, a structured social environment with its own hierarchies and rituals that provided something divorce had temporarily disrupted. A daily schedule, colleagues, a sense of being somewhere specific and useful. The working day of the 1950s office began at 9 and ended at 5. Lunch was 45 minutes to an hour, often eaten at a lunch counter nearby or in the office lunchroom. The work itself, typing, filing, answering telephones, taking dictation, managing schedules, was physically undemanding but required concentration and a willingness to manage the often complicated personalities of the men whose offices you supported. The relationship between secretary and boss in this era was formalized, hierarchical, and frequently paternalistic in ways that could range from entirely harmless to actively uncomfortable. The salary for an office secretary in the middle of the decade was somewhere between $40 and $60 per week, depending on the city and the industry and the size of firm. This was not enough on its own to rent an apartment, feed 2 children, buy suitable work clothing, and pay for the transportation necessary to get to and from work. It was almost enough when combined with child support that arrived on time, which meant that the monthly financial management of a divorced working mother in 1955 was a continuous exercise in mathematical creativity. You learn quickly what things cost and what things cost too much. You learn the particular skill of the woman who is managing on a specific amount each month, the mental accounting, the small negotiations with yourself about what was necessary and what was not, the way that a minor unexpected expense like a child's shoe falling apart or the bus fare going up by a nickel could require a reorganization of the rest of the week's budget. You also learn about credit and about the ways in which the absence of independent credit history made your financial life considerably more fragile than it would otherwise have been. You could not get a department store charge account in your own name. These required either a husband's signature or the kind of income and credit history that a recently divorced woman rarely had. You could not finance a car without a cosigner. If something broke, the refrigerator in the rented apartment, the washing machine, the children's winter coats wearing out faster than expected, you paid for it in cash or you did not pay for it at all. The financial education that many women received in the months and years following divorce in the 1950s was, in many ways, the most thorough education in practical economics they had ever received. Not because it was pleasant, but because it was inescapable. Money became concrete and immediate and specific in a way that the financial arrangements of marriage, where someone else managed the savings and signed the large documents and handled the annual tax filing, had never required. Some women found this unexpectedly clarifying, even amid the difficulty. The sense of being in direct contact with the mechanisms of one's own financial life, of knowing exactly where every dollar came from and where every dollar went, had a kind of ground-level reality to it that some women described later as one of the few genuinely positive things about the early years of divorce life. But clarity is easier to appreciate in retrospect than in the moment when you're doing it at the kitchen table at 9:30 in the evening with the children finally asleep and the bills spread in front of you and a cup of tea that has gone cold. The children knew something before you told them. Children always know something. They may not know the word for it. They may not be able to name it or articulate it or situate it in any framework they can use. But children are acute readers of the emotional weather in their households. And the weather in a household where a marriage is ending has a very specific quality that children register before they can explain what they are registering. The question of how to tell the children was one of the things divorce guidebooks of the 1950s addressed. Insofar as divorce guidebooks existed, they were still relatively rare, because the popular press was conflicted about whether to acknowledge divorce normatively enough to offer practical guides to it. Some advice columns addressed the question. A few books on marriage included chapters on what to do if things went wrong. Therapists who worked with divorcing families had professional opinions. The general consensus, such as it was, leaned toward honesty appropriate to age, telling children what had happened in terms they could understand without burdening them with details that were not theirs to carry. This was sound advice that was often honored in the breach, partly because the adults involved were simultaneously managing their own emotional upheaval and were not always at their most measured when it came to protecting their children from the weight of what had happened. Children of divorced parents in 1950s America were a category that had its own social marker. The phrase child of a broken home was in regular circulation and was applied with a consistency that made it function almost as a clinical description. A broken home was understood to be a house from which one parent, almost always a father, was absent, and children who came from broken homes were understood, by the popular wisdom of the era, to be at elevated risk for a range of difficulties: academic underachievement, behavioral problems, emotional instability, a tendency toward moral laxity that was understood as a predictable consequence of inadequate paternal guidance. This popular wisdom was not entirely without empirical foundation. Children of divorce did, on average, face certain additional stresses and complications. But the way it was framed in the 1950s laid the responsibility for those complications almost entirely on the divorce itself, and the divorce almost entirely on the woman who had initiated it, rather than examining the more complicated set of factors that actually shaped children's outcomes. The child of divorce was treated as a damage unit, and the mother who had created that unit through the act of ending the marriage was implicitly or explicitly the person responsible for the damage. This framing had real consequences. Custody law in 1950s America operated under what was called a tender years doctrine, the legal presumption, in effect since the 19th century, that young children were best served by being in the custody of their mothers. In practice, this meant that women almost always received primary custody of children after divorce, which was both a recognition of their role as primary caregivers and an additional financial burden. Since raising children costs money in ways that compound quickly, the father was typically awarded visitation, the legal right to spend specific designated time with the children, often every other weekend, and some share holidays and summer. The exact terms were negotiated or litigated depending on the circumstances. What every other weekend looked like in practice varied enormously. Ideally, it looked like a father who arrived on Saturday morning, took the children to the park or the movies or a hamburger restaurant, and returned them on Sunday evening, having had a day of comfortable, continuous relationship maintenance. In practice, it was often more complicated. The children who were excited to see him and then disappointed by something, or the father who was adjusting to a new domestic situation of his own and for whom the every other weekend arrangement felt both insufficient and impossibly weighted with significance, or the logistical negotiation of holiday schedules that involved two different houses with two different rhythms, and the children moving between them with the slightly glazed adaptability of people who have learned to pack a bag very efficiently. The handoff, the moment when the children moved from one parent to the other, was one of the most emotionally loaded routine events of divorced family life in any era, and the 1950s was no exception. In the best cases, it was brief and civil, and the children transitioned smoothly. In more difficult cases, it was a scene of negotiations, tensions, or emotional displays that the children absorbed and carried with them. The school was another social arena. Teachers in the 1950s were trained to look for the signs of what the textbooks of the era called home problems, and the child of divorced family was understood to be a child who came with a home problem already established. This could manifest as additional attention and care from a perceptive teacher, or as a set of low-level expectations that the child was being set up to struggle, or as the kind of labeling that had its own self-fulfilling quality. The child's peers were perhaps the most direct mirrors of the social attitude. Children, who are efficient transmitters of their parents' values without the smoothing that adult social interaction provides, could be startlingly direct about the status of a child with divorced parents. You had no dad. Your parents were divorced. Your family was broken. These were not always said cruelly, Sometimes they were said with the frank, slightly clinical curiosity of children trying to categorize something new. But they were said, and the child of divorced parents in 1955 heard them. What was also true, and worth saying, is that many children adapted. Children are not simply passive recipients of their circumstances, and many children of divorce in this era develop resources, resilience, self-reliance, and early maturity, a facility for managing complicated emotional situations that serve them in unexpected ways. The experience was difficult and the social context was unkind, but difficulty and kindness are not the only factors that shape a person. And the mothers who were raising these children alone and with insufficient resources, and under the constant social judgment of a decade that blamed them for what had happened, were frequently doing something extraordinary, even when it looked from the outside like simple survival. You are at the grocery store. A Thursday afternoon in October. The fluorescent lights hum above the linoleum floors. The canned goods are neatly faced on their shelves. You have a cart with a slightly sticky handle and a list written on the back of an envelope, and two children who are at school and will need to be collected in an hour and a half. You know the woman in the next aisle. She goes to your former church. She is married to an accountant named Howard and has 3 children who went to school with yours. She is someone you have chatted with at the church socials and at the school events and at the neighborhood 4th of July parties. Not a close friend, but someone you've been friendly with for years in the pleasant, low-maintenance way of neighborhood acquaintance. She sees you. Something moves across her face. Recognition. And then something after recognition. A slight recalibration that takes about half a second, but is absolutely visible if you are watching for it. She smiles. The smile is warm, but there is something careful in it. She asks how you are. You say fine. You are doing fine. And how is Howard? And how are the children? And she says they are all doing fine. And there is a brief and almost imperceptible pause where the easy next subject of conversation would be your husband and your children. And she navigates around that pause with the practiced grace of someone who has been briefed that there's a pause there and has decided to step over it rather than into it. She mentions that she has to get to the butcher before he closes. You both say something pleasant about the weather. She moves her cart, and you move yours, and you are both in different aisles. You stand in front of the canned tomatoes for a moment. Your cart handle is still slightly sticky. The fluorescent lights are still humming. Nothing terrible has happened. Nothing dramatic at all. Just a half-second pause and the careful smile and the small social dexterity of a woman navigating around a subject that has been defined by the social code of your neighborhood as sensitive. But you felt it. You will feel versions of this for the next several years, in grocery stores and school lobbies and church parking lots and dinner parties, to which you are invited with less frequency than before, or not at all. The particular social texture of being a divorcee in 1950s America is not usually dramatic. It is usually exactly this. The half-second pause, the careful smile, the conversation that steps around you rather than towards you. The word itself carried weight. Divorcee. The French inflection is not accidental. American English borrowed the term from French, and the borrowing carried a faint cultural freight, a suggestion of sophistication adjacent to immorality that was part of the era's ambivalence about divorced women. A divorcee was not simply a woman who had been through a divorce. She was a category. The categories available to women in 1950s America were fairly well defined. Wife, mother, widow. These were the respectable ones, each carrying a specific social identity and a set of understood expectations and permissions. Single woman, for the young, this was acceptable, a transitional status on the way to wife. For the older, it carried its own stigma, the spinster narrative. Divorcee was its own category, distinct from all of these, carrying implications that were not entirely resolved. Some of the implications were about morality. The popular culture of the era, the films, the novels, the television dramas, the advice columns, frequently portrayed the divorcee as a particular kind of social risk. She was attractive, presumably, since she had been married and therefore had demonstrated a certain appeal. She was unattached, which meant she was available. And she was experienced, which in the 1950s meant something specific about the understanding of married women's relationship to adult sexuality. The divorcee was a woman other wives were sometimes warned about, in the specific sense that a woman who had failed to maintain her own marriage was sometimes characterized as a potential threat to the marriages around her. This characterization was not universal, and many divorced women had neighbors and friends who were entirely supportive and entirely unthreatened. But the characterization was common enough and appeared in the popular media frequently enough that it was a known element of the social landscape that divorced women had to navigate. The practical consequences of the divorcee label varied by context. In professional settings, divorce was technically irrelevant. But in a decade when professional settings were themselves quite personal and social reputation was considered a legitimate consideration in hiring, a woman known to be divorced might find certain doors less open than they had been. In social settings, the invitation list for the kind of dinner parties and couples events that organize suburban social life in this era was typically constructed around pairs, and a single woman, even a divorced woman who was pleasant company and a reliable guest, disrupted the geometry of the evening in a way that not every host was comfortable managing. In the children's school community, the divorcee label meant that your children's friendships were sometimes subject to parental approval that operated through the lens of your family status. Some parents preferred that their children spend time in homes that reflected the two-parent ideal. This was not always stated explicitly. It often did not need to be. And in the dating world, which we will get to shortly and which had its own elaborate complications, the divorcee status meant that the social protocols of courtship and romantic possibility were organized around a set of rules that had been designed for never-married women and that fit divorced women with roughly the same precision as clothing designed for a different body, technically wearable but requiring constant adjustment. What the women who lived through this era described, looking back from the distance of decades, was not primarily hatred or dramatic exclusion. It was a texture being slightly outside the world that had been designed around the assumption that you fit inside it, not invisible, but at a slight remove, seen, but through a particular lens, known, but slightly differently than you knew yourself. It was a minor key played persistently underneath the louder notes of daily life, and minor keys, sustained long enough, have a way of shaping how everything else sounds. The popular culture of the 1950s had a great deal to say about divorced women, and almost none of it was delivered in a manner that could be described as particularly helpful to anyone who was actually one. Films have been engaging with divorce as a subject since the silent era, and by the 1950s Hollywood had developed a fairly consistent vocabulary for the divorced woman character. She appeared in a handful of recognizable types. There was a tragic divorcee, the woman whose marriage had ended through no particular fault of her own, whose suffering was depicted with genuine sympathy, and whose story was ultimately a cautionary tale about the difficulty of female life. There was a sophisticated divorcee, the woman, usually wealthy and well-dressed, who moved through post-marital life with a kind of glamorous independence that was depicted as both admirable and slightly dangerous. And there was the desperate divorcee, the middle-class or working-class woman whose divorce had left her in difficult circumstances and whose story tracked her attempts to rebuild through a combination of hard work, patience, and the eventual arrival of a good man who would restore order to her situation. The sophisticated divorcee character was particularly interesting as a cultural artifact because she represented, in some ways, the fantasy version of divorce life, the version in which all the financial and social consequences had been neatly removed. She wore good clothes. She had a well-appointed apartment in a city. She went to dinner and attended parties and was clearly enjoying a kind of freedom that her married counterparts might privately envy. She was attractive and witty and capable of the kind of autonomous self-determination that the decade officially frowned upon but privately found compelling. The problem with this character was that she bore essentially no relationship to the actual experience of almost any divorced woman in 1950s America. The sophisticated divorcee's economic independence came from somewhat the films were generally vague about: a divorce settlement from extremely wealthy former husband, perhaps, or an inherited income, or simply the narrative convenience of not having to worry about money. So the story could be about other things: the specific financial desperation of the ordinary divorced woman, the grocery store budget management, and the unreliable alimony check, and the inability to get credit was not glamorous enough for films that prefer their divorcees sophisticated. The desperate divorcee's story was more realistic in its circumstances, but less in its resolution. These films almost always ended with the woman finding a second marriage, a good man who recognized her worth and offered her the stability she had been struggling without. The message was both sympathetic and conservative. Yes, the situation is difficult. Yes, she has been through something hard, and the correct solution is the restoration of the family structure she lost. The woman who found her own way without the organizing principle of new marriage was much rarer as a film protagonist in the 50s, because Hollywood's commercial instincts were closely aligned with the decade's social instincts about how stories were supposed to end. Television was, if anything, more conservative. The domestic sitcom that dominated prime time in the 50s was built entirely around the intact family unit, and divorce was almost entirely absent from these narratives. When family difficulty appeared in these shows, it was of a gentle, comic variety that resolved within 30 minutes and left no lasting structural damage. A character who was divorced appeared occasionally, but she was typically a secondary figure. The neighbor, the co-worker, the aunt, rather than protagonists around whom the story organized itself. Women's magazines, which reached an audience that was enormous and demographically specific, had the most sustained and complicated relationship with the question of divorce. The magazines were caught in a genuine tension. Their readers were, in significant numbers, women who were in unhappy marriages, or who were going through divorces, or who had friends or sisters going through divorces. These readers had real questions and real needs. But the magazines were also deeply invested, both commercially and editorially, in the domestic ideal that their advertising was built around, and that ideal did not have a comfortable place for divorce. The compromise the magazines arrived at through the 1950s was a kind of dual-track approach. On one track, they published aspirational domestic content, recipes, home decorating, beauty and fashion advice, marriage guidance, that assumed and celebrated the intact two-parent family. On the other track, they published occasional long-form features and advice columns that addressed the reality of divorce in terms that were sympathetic without being too explicitly validating, that acknowledged experience without endorsing the choice. The advice that emerged from this dual-track approach was often earnest and well-intentioned and reflected the best thinking of the era, while also being shaped by the assumptions that limited the era's best thinking. Women were advised to be patient, to seek professional guidance, to ensure they had truly exhausted every option before filing. They were advised to think carefully about the financial consequences. They were advised to protect the children's relationship with their father, which was sound advice, delivered in a tone that suggested the primary responsibility for that protection lay with the mother. They were advised on how to present themselves to potential future employers, future landlords, future romantic partners, in ways that would minimize the stigma of their status. What was notably absent from most of this advice was any acknowledgement that the structural conditions of divorced women's lives, the legal framework that protected men's property claims, the credit system that excluded women, the labor market that underpaid female workers, were themselves problems that required structural solutions rather than individual adaptations. The advice was aimed at helping individual women navigate a system, not at questioning whether the system deserved to be navigated. The exception to this came from a handful of writers and reformers who were beginning quietly and without much popular platform in the early and middle 1950s to articulate the structural critique. Betty Friedan, researching what would become the feminine mystique, was collecting data through the decade on the real conditions of women's lives inside and outside of marriage. Sociologists at universities were publishing papers that documented the financial aftermath of divorce for women in terms that were difficult to dismiss as sentiment. Legal reformers were drafting proposals for property law changes. These voices were not yet mainstream, and they would not become mainstream until the following decade. But they were present, they were accumulating, and they were building the archive of evidence that would eventually change the conversation. In the meantime, the magazines kept publishing their casserole recipes and their beauty tips and their careful, sympathetic, structurally uncritical advice to women navigating a world that had not been built for them. And the women kept reading the magazines and buying the casserole ingredients and putting on lipstick before they went to their lawyers' offices. And the television kept showing the families in which everything worked out in 30 minutes. And the world kept being the complicated, difficult, occasionally remarkable thing that it was. There's a specific kind of conversation that happened in 1950s America that has no modern equivalent, and that deserves to be described in its particular details. You are sitting across a desk from a bank officer. The desk is solid wood, the good kind, and the bank officer is in a suit with a vest, and he has a pen set on the desk that is more decorative than functional. The bank is a serious building, marble or granite, with teller windows and a heavy clock on the wall, and particular hush quality of a place where money lives and expects a certain decorum. You have come to open a checking account, or to apply for a small personal loan, or to establish a line of credit that will give you some financial flexibility in the months ahead. These are reasonable adult financial needs. You are a reasonable adult woman. The bank officer looks at your application. He looks at it for a moment in the way that people look at things when they already know what the answer is and are deciding how to phrase it. He asks about your husband. You explain that you are divorced. He makes a small note. He asks about your income. You tell him. He asks who your employer is. You tell him. He asks if you have a cosigner available. The cosigner requirement was a mechanism through which the banking system of the 1950s managed its uncertainty about women as financial actors. The cosigner was almost always understood to be a man, a father, a brother, an employer, a former husband who had remarkably agreed to remain involved in this specific way. If you had such a man willing to stand behind your creditworthiness, your account or loan was possible. If you did not, the bank officer's expression became politely regretful. The legal structure supporting this was considerable. The credit laws of most states in this era did not prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex. Banks and other lenders were private institutions making commercial decisions within broad legal parameters, and those parameters allowed them to consider a woman's marital status as a legitimate factor in credit decisions. The reasoning, seldom stated directly but embedded in the practice, was that women's financial reliability was contingent on their domestic situation. An unmarried or divorced woman was, in the financial logic of the era, an incomplete economic unit. This was not universal. Some banks and some bank officers were more flexible than others. Some women found ways to establish independent financial identities through professional connections of their employers or through the patient cultivation of relationships with specific banking institutions that were somewhat less rigid in their application of the unwritten rules. But these were exceptions, achieved through persistence and often through the intervention of someone with institutional standing. The more common experience was a polite refusal, not hostile, not contemptuous, simply businesslike in a way that the 1950s considered itself businesslike about many things that were, in fact, profoundly social judgments dressed in the language of financial prudence. You left the bank with your coat still buttoned and your gloves still on because you had not taken them off and your purse under your arm. You walked back down the marble steps into whatever the day was doing. You had been declined or deferred or given conditions you could not meet. You had come up against, in its most explicit and institutional form, the thing you've been coming up against in smaller and less formal ways since a divorce, the organized assumption of the decade that a woman alone was an incomplete thing, a provisional arrangement pending the restoration of proper domestic order. You found another way, or you waited until circumstances changed enough to try again, or you found the one bank officer in the city who was willing to extend the courtesy of treating you as a financially capable adult you actually were. And you added it to the growing inventory of things you had managed on your own in a world that had not particularly expected you to manage them, which is, when you think about it, an accounting that tells a different story than the official ledger of the 1950s ever quite captured. There came a point for many women going through divorce in the 1950s when someone suggested they see a doctor, not for a physical complaint, necessarily, though the physical symptoms of prolonged stress were real and present. The headaches, the disrupted sleep, the appetite that had reorganized itself around something other than hunger, the general feeling of the body operating at a different voltage than usual. The doctor was suggested for the deeper problem, the underlying distress that was producing these physical symptoms, the emotional problem, the psychological problem. The 1950s were a decade of remarkable enthusiasm for psychological medicine. Psychoanalysis, which had arrived from Europe in the early part of the century, had by the 1950s become a significant cultural presence in American cities, particularly on the coast, particularly in professional and educated circles. The terms of psychoanalytic thought had percolated into the popular culture in ways that made them familiar even to people who had never sat across from a therapist. Repressions, neuroses, complexes, the unconscious. These were words that appeared in novels and films and magazine articles and cocktail party conversations. For the woman going through divorce, the medical establishment of the 1950s offered several things. One was a general practitioner, the family doctor who had probably been seeing your family for years and who occupied a 1950s medicine position of a kind of secular confessor, the person to whom you brought your body's difficulties and who was expected to address the whole person, not just a specific complaint. The family doctor's toolkit for addressing the emotional distress of a divorcing woman was largely pharmacological by the mid-1950s. 1955 saw the introduction of Milltown meprobamate, the first mass-market tranquilizer in American history, and its reception was extraordinary. Milltown was prescribed in enormous quantities within its first year on the market. By 1956, it was estimated that 1 in 20 Americans was taking it. The drug reduced anxiety, produced a mild sedating effect, and was described in the popular press with a breathless enthusiasm that suggests the decade had been waiting for something like this and did not have strong reservations about taking it. The terminology that attached to Milltown and to the similar medications that followed in the next few years, including Librium in 1960, was gendered in ways that would become more visible only later. These medications were frequently described in advertising and in popular coverage as being appropriate for the nervous woman, the woman whose anxiety or depression was creating difficulties for herself and her household. They were marketed to general practitioners with case studies featuring anxious housewives and overwhelmed mothers. The woman who was managing too much or feeling too much was offered chemistry as a solution. For the divorced woman, the Milltown prescription was sometimes offering the spirit of genuine concern and appropriate care. Anxiety disorders and depression are real conditions that can genuinely benefit from medical treatment. But it was also sometimes offered as a management strategy for distress that was primarily situational, caused not by a chemical imbalance, but by the actual circumstances of her life, which were genuinely difficult, and for which the appropriate response might have been structural support rather than pharmacological sedation. The psychiatrist, if you had access to one, which required either money or a hospital setting, was likely to be Freudian in orientation. Freud and psychiatry of the 1950s had some very specific things to say about women and marriage and divorce. The basic framework located women's psychology and their relationship to their biology and their domestic role in ways that tended to interpret a woman's unhappiness in marriage as evidence of unresolved conflicts within herself rather than as a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation. Some psychiatrists were genuinely helpful to women going through divorce, offering something that was rare in 1950s daily life, a place to speak honestly about what was happening, with a professional obligation of confidentiality, in an era when honesty about domestic difficulty was socially dangerous. The therapy room, whatever its theoretical framework, sometimes functioned as the only space where the thing could be said. But the psychiatric community of this era also produced some genuinely peculiar advice. The idea that a woman's desire to work, to have professional ambitions, to resist a domestic role, was a form of neurosis, a penis envy issue in the Freudian language of the day, was current in some psychiatric thinking and influenced how some practitioners understood the divorced woman who was trying to rebuild an independent life. A woman who wanted to work was sometimes understood as working through her masculine identification issues. A woman who seemed angry at her former husband was sometimes understood as projecting unresolved hostility from her relationship with her father. The actual circumstances of her life, the financial difficulty, the social isolation, the legal system that had just put her through an adversarial process, were sometimes peripheral to a framework that located the problem inside her rather than around her. The women who went to doctors' offices in the 1950s and described the difficulty of their divorces were heard by individual practitioners of wildly varying quality, compassion, and insight. Some were heard by people who helped them. Some were heard by people who gave them pills. Some were heard by people who told them, in the measured language of clinical authority, that the difficulty they were experiencing was a reflection of their own pathology, and that the appropriate response was to examine themselves more carefully. This was not universal, but it was common enough to be representative of the era's medical response to women's distress. And if the doctor's office was not always a reliable source of support, the alternative destinations for that distress, the friend's kitchen, the phone call to your sister, the letter you wrote late at night, often did better, simply by being untheoretical about what you needed. Everything we have talked about so far has been largely, though not exclusively, the experience of a woman in a 1950s divorce. This reflected historical record to some extent. Women's experiences in this era were more extensively documented by the reform movements and sociological studies that examined divorce, partly because women bore the greater share of the social and financial consequences. But men went through divorce too, and their experience had its own specific texture. The social code of 1950s masculinity had very little language for emotional difficulty. Men of this era were expected to be competent, composed, and capable. They were expected to solve problems, not to be undone by them. Divorce, as a personal failure, sat very uncomfortably within this framework. The man who could not keep his marriage together had failed at something the culture considered fundamental to adult male identity: the provision of stability, the protection of his family, the successful management of the domestic world that was supposed to be in his care. This did not mean that men did not feel things. The accounts left by men who divorced in this era, in letters, in the diaries that some men kept, in interviews conducted years later, make clear that divorce was frequently experienced as a profound loss of the daily life of his children, of the domestic routines that had organized his time, of the social identity of husband and father that shaped how he was perceived and how he perceived himself. The father who moved out family home was moving into a bachelor apartment or a rented room, or, if he was lucky, a furnished apartment that was adequate without being comfortable. The cooking that had been done in the family kitchen was now being done by him, which in the 1950s meant it was sometimes done very badly, because many men of that generation had genuinely not learned to cook in any meaningful way. The social arrangement that had organized his leisure time around the family was now gone. Saturday afternoons that had been spent in the backyard with the children were now unstructured in a way that was more disorienting than liberating. The children were with the mother every other weekend. In theory, in the standard arrangement, he had them. The rest of the time, he did not. For some men, this was a profound grief. For others, the every other weekend schedule felt like an insufficient parent-child relationship that was better than nothing, but fell far short what the word father was supposed to mean. The financial obligation continued, the alimony payment, the child support payment, which meant that the man who had been supporting one household was now effectively supporting one and a half or two households on the same income. His apartment, his food, his transportation, plus the payments to the former household. The financial arithmetic was often genuinely difficult even for men who earned reasonable salaries. Socially, the divorced man occupied a different position than the divorced woman, and it was not without advantages. Men who were divorced were not automatically coded as failed or damaged in the way that divorced women were. A divorced man was, in the social shorthand of the era, a man who had been through something difficult and had survived it. He might even carry a certain romantic melancholy that was, if anything, slightly attractive. The middle-aged divorced man who was eligible to remarry occupied a social niche that was, if not celebrated, then at least understood. The remarriage rate for divorced men was substantially higher than for divorced women in this era. Men remarried more quickly after divorce, more frequently, and with younger partners than they had been. The dating market for divorced men was more generous than the dating market for divorced women, partly because of demographics. Women outlived men, so the pool of available women was larger, and partly because the social coding of male eligibility was less age-dependent and less rigidly tied to the categories of married versus divorced in the way that female eligibility was. But the men who struggled, and they existed in real numbers, struggled with things that the era gave them very little vocabulary for. The loneliness was not something you admitted. The difficulty of the every other weekend father relationship was not something you complained about, because men of this era did not complain about their emotions in social settings. The grief of losing the daily texture of family life was something you managed internally, through work or through drink or through the new relationship that you started, perhaps more quickly than was wise, because the new relationship gave you back the structure and the warmth and the daily human contact that had been subtracted. The psychiatrists who treated men going through divorce in the 1950s were often more available than those treating women, partly because male patients commanded more professional attention in a medical culture that took men's distress more seriously as a clinical matter. But men were also less likely to seek treatment in the first place, because seeking treatment required admitting that something inside you was not working correctly, which conflicted with the 1950s male identity in its most foundational way. So the men often managed alone in their bachelor apartments, making somewhat inadequate meals and calling the children on the telephone, and go to work on Monday morning with the practiced composure of someone who has decided that this is what composure looks like, regardless of what is happening underneath. Both sides of this story are genuinely difficult. Neither one wins the difficulty competition. They are simply two different shapes of the same disruption, experienced through bodies and social positions that the decade had organized very differently. Let us say it has been 8 months, or a year, or 18 months, long enough that the acute crisis period has stabilized into something more like a chronic adjustment. The apartment is organized. The children are in school and managing reasonably well. The job is established, and the paycheck arrives more or less when it is supposed to. The social circle has reshuffled, and the people who remain in it are the ones who are genuinely present. And someone has suggested, a friend, a sister, a colleague with good intentions, that you might consider going out again. This suggestion, innocuous on its face, arrived in 1955 America with a set of social complications that had no instruction manual. Dating, as a cultural institution, in the 1950s was already a complex system with very specific rules for the young and single. For a divorced woman in her late 20s or 30s, the rules were different, in some ways more permissive, in other ways considerably more fraught. The dating culture of the 50s was organized around a particular sequence of social rituals that worked best for people who had not previously been married. Boy calls girl. Boy takes girl out. Boy and girl go steady. Boy proposes. Girl accepts. This sequence assumed a kind of first-time innocence about the whole enterprise that did not apply to someone who had already been through the sequence and found it insufficient. The divorced woman who was considering dating again was working with knowledge and experience that did not fit neatly into the cultural script. She had been intimate with someone. She had been through the daily reality of married life. She had opinions, formed through experience rather than anticipation, about what she was looking for. She was, in the language the era would have used, a different category of participant than the never-married woman of 22 who was going to her first formal dance. This made some men uncomfortable. The ease of the cultural script was part of its appeal, and the divorced woman disrupted the script by having already lived through it. Some men found this appealing. The directness, the lack of artifice, the reality of a woman who had been somewhere and had thoughts about it. Others found it threatening, in the way that the 1950s found confident female knowledge somewhat threatening in general. The question of children was immediate and serious. If you had children, they were part of your life in a way that was not optional and not discretionary. A man who was interested in you was also, by necessary extension, being considered in relation to your children. Not formally, not in the first or second or third meeting. But the question of what his relationship to your children would be was one that had to be answered eventually, and that was hovering at the edge of every conversation from the beginning. Some men were genuinely at ease with children and with the reality of dating a woman who had them. Others were theoretically willing but practically unprepared for what that actually meant. The children's presence at dinners they had imagined as adult evenings, the school events that reorganized the schedule, the constant low-level negotiation of time that parenthood required. The men who stayed through the reality of this were different from the men who were comfortable with the idea of it. The question of physical intimacy in 1950s dating was also, for the divorced woman, navigated through a set of conflicting signals. The sexual mores of the decade were officially quite conservative. Premarital sex was widely acknowledged to happen but was not approved of an explicit public discourse of the era, particularly for women. Nice women waited. Nice women did not offer what could not be taken back. Nice women understood that physical intimacy was a currency of commitment and was not to be dispensed before commitment had been secured. But the divorced woman had already been married. The ordinary logic of waiting that applied to unmarried women did not quite apply in the same way. She was neither the innocent girl of the script nor the calculating adventuress of the cautionary tale. She was simply a person who had adult experience and adult needs and no very clear cultural roadmap for how to navigate them honestly. Some women found that they were treated by potential partners with less of the formal courtship that the culture directed toward unmarried women, a familiarity that assumed her experience meant she was more available than a never married woman would be. This could be annoying or offensive or simply practical to manage, depending on the man and the situation. Others found the opposite. Men who treated them with an almost excessive formality, as if the divorce status were a fragility that required special handling. The social rituals of dating, the dinner, the movie, the drive-in theater, the country club dance, if you move in those circles, had the same shape in 1955 for the divorced woman as for anyone else. But they were inhabited differently, with more awareness of what they meant and what they were for, and with less time and tolerance of performances that courtship required from younger people who had more both. Women who dated as divorced mothers in this era developed a particular skill, the skill of being genuinely present in an evening, while also managing the background awareness of the children at home, the babysitter whose bedtime curfew was approaching, the school morning that would come whether or not tonight went well. This was not unique to divorced mothers. Widows had always navigated it, but it was new enough to the social script of the 50s that there were very few models for how to do it with ease. Some women found love again during this period, genuinely, surprisingly, in forms that they had not expected, and that complicated their previous ideas about what love meant or what a relationship was for. The experience of having married young and badly and gotten out was not always a cautionary tale. Sometimes it was a map, imperfect and annotated with wrong turns, but a map nonetheless. And some found that what they had built by themselves, however difficult and however small, was something they were not ready to risk again. Not yet, maybe not ever. The apartment with the drawings on the white walls and the slightly sticky card handle and the children who needed collecting at 3:30. This was a life that was genuinely theirs in ways that the marriage had not been. That was worth something. That was worth protecting. Everyone talks about the before and the after. The before, the marriage, the decision, the legal process, the first terrifying weeks of new life. And the after, the eventual stability, the reconfigured family, the new rhythms. What people talk about less is the long middle, the months, often stretching to several years, between the acute disruption of the divorce and the arrival at something that could be called settled. The long middle was the ordinary time, not the dramatic time of courtrooms and moving days and first apartments. The time when the situation had become simply the situation, the new normal before that phrase existed. In the long middle, you got up in the morning and made the children's breakfast and sent them to school and went to work and came home and made dinner and put the children to bed and did whatever needed doing in the evening and went to sleep and did it again. The divorce was not the daily fact of your life anymore. It was the context of your life, the frame around everything else, invisible precisely because it was always there. The children grew during the long middle. They grew in the specific way that children grow, which is constantly and perceptibly and in ways that surprise you if you look away for a moment. The child who was 7 when the divorce happened was 9, was 11, was developing opinions about things that you had not known they would have opinions about. The child who had cried on the first night was old enough to understand things now that they had not been old enough to understand then, and the conversation that you had always known was coming. The real conversation, the one where they asked real questions, arrived in its own time. The relationship of the children's father evolved through the long middle in ways that varied enormously by case. Some former couples arrived, over time, at something functional and even cordial. The ability to sit in the same school gymnasium for a holiday concert without the air in the room becoming charged, the ability to make a telephone call about the children without the call becoming about anything else. This was harder than it sounds and required from both people something that was not quite forgiveness and not quite indifference, but somewhere in the neighborhood of both. Some former couples never arrived there. They remained throughout the long middle and into the long after, in a state of managed hostility or cold disengagement that the children navigated with a particular resilience and private sorrow that children of contested divorces develop. These were also common outcomes. The research on this, conducted in later decades, would confirm what observation had already suggested. that the quality of the post-divorce co-parenting relationship was one of the most significant factors in how children fared, and that the quality of that relationship was often determined by factors that had nothing to do with what was best for the children. The long middle had its pleasures. Even so, this is important to say, because the 1950s divorce narrative has a tendency to flatten into pure suffering. And pure suffering is not what most people's lives consist of, even in the hardest periods. There were evenings when the apartment was warm and the children were in bed, and you were reading something you had not had time to read in years. And the quiet was genuinely quiet in a way that is restful rather than lonely. There were Saturday mornings when the children were with their father and the day was entirely yours, unscheduled, unoccupied, available, and you could go to a museum or a park or simply walk through the city without a destination, which in a decade when women's public mobility was somewhat constrained by the social expectation that women were accompanied, was its own small liberation. There were friendships that deepened during this period, with the women who had stayed, and the ones who had come in from the new life, the ones who understood the situation without requiring it to be explained. There were conversations over kitchen tables that lasted past midnight, the kind of conversations that only happen when people are genuinely past the social performance of their easier selves. The long middle shaped people, not always into the shapes they would have chosen, but into shapes that were genuinely their own. The woman who had been a wife and then had been a divorcing woman and was now simply a woman who lived in an apartment and raised children and worked at a job and had opinions and read books and made decisions. This woman was not the woman she had been at 20, standing in a shirtwaist dress in a kitchen she could not have rented without his name on the lease. She was something different, something harder one, something that the 1950s, with all its confident certainty about what women were and were not capable of managing, had perhaps not entirely anticipated. Statistics are, in their quiet way, very opinionated, and the statistics of remarriage in 1950s America have a very strong opinion about what happened after divorce. The majority of divorced Americans in this era remarried. Among divorced men, the figure was approximately 3/4 within a decade. Among divorced women, somewhat lower, in the range of 2/3, with considerable variation by age. Women who divorced in their 20s or early 30s remarried at high rates. Women who divorced in their 40s or later were significantly less likely to, both because the dating market was organized differently for older women and because some of them had decided, for their own reasons, that they preferred not to. The remarriage rate being as high as it was tells you something interesting about how people experience divorce in this era. Despite everything, despite the legal difficulty, the social stigma, the financial devastation, the logistical complexity of shared custody and reorganized family structures, the majority of people who went through it eventually chose to try again. Not always, and not in all cases, and with the full weight of what they now knew about what marriage actually involved. But still, the motivation for remarriage was not purely romantic. For women, it frequently had a significant practical component that was, under the circumstances, entirely rational. Remarriage meant, in most cases, a second income. It meant, often, a more stable housing situation. It meant, if things went well, a co-parent for the children, a domestic partner who shared the daily weight of managing a household and raising people. These were not small things. They were, in the context of the 1950s, often the difference between a life that was merely difficult and a life that was genuinely functional. The person you might marry in the second marriage was often someone with their own prior experience, another divorced person, or a widower, or a man who had reached his late 30s without marrying and was now more ready for it than he had been at 25. Second marriages in this era were often between people who brought more knowledge and more realistic expectations to the institution than they had brought the first time. This did not guarantee success, but it changed the texture of the attempt. The second wedding was almost never the wedding the first one had been. In the 1950s, second marriages were typically small and private, a courthouse ceremony or a small gathering of close family and friends, with none of the elaborate rituals of the first wedding. The white dress in the church and the reception with the extended family all watching. These were understood to be for first marriages, and second marriages were supposed to be more modest in their claims on ceremony and public attention. This was not entirely unkind. The modesty felt appropriate, perhaps, to people who had been to the first version, and understood better what they were actually agreeing to. The children experienced the second marriage from a position of particular complexity. A new partner entering the household meant a renegotiation of every established relationship within it. The children who had had their mother to themselves or had been managing the back and forth between two separate households now had a new person in the domestic space who had a specific and still undefined role. Not the father, but in the house. Present at breakfast. Present at the dinner table. Present in the particular domestic intimacy that family life requires. And that is very hard to manage with someone you did not choose and are not yet sure about. The step-parent relationship was not something the 1950s had a very refined social script for. The fairy tale version of the step-parent was distinctly unflattering. The wicked stepmother was the most powerful figure in that tradition, and while nobody seriously applied that template to man who had married your mother, the general cultural framework for understanding the step-parent was thin, and the models for getting it right were not widely available. Some second marriages were, by all available evidence, considerably better than the first, more considered, more honest, entered into by people who understood themselves better and knew more clearly what they needed. Some second marriages repeated the patterns of the first, which is what happens when the problems that contributed to the first divorce have not been examined or resolved. The human capacity for optimism in the face of prior experience is extraordinary and not always well advised. But the people who remarried and found something better were not just lucky. They were often people who had used the difficulty of the first experience as genuine information about themselves, about what they needed, about what they could and could not live with. They had been educated by the hardest kind of school, and the education had taken. That is not nothing. In the 1950s, it was something quite significant. Through the 1950s, while all of this was happening to the 1 in 4 marriages that ended in divorce, something else was also quietly happening at the edges of the legal and social landscape. People were thinking, talking, writing about whether the system made any sense. The fault-based divorce system had defenders, those who argued that making divorce difficult protected the institution of marriage, protected children, prevented impulsive decisions. The argument was not entirely without merit. A system that required people to genuinely exhaust other options before accessing divorce might, theoretically, prevent some divorces that could have been avoided with time and effort. But the system also produced a charade that legal scholar after legal scholar had documented. The staged adultery, the coached testimony, the legal fiction that bore only a formal resemblance to what had actually happened. It produced a Nevada escape valve that was available only to those with money. It produced a situation in which people who wanted to leave genuinely intolerable marriages were required to perform the specific legal dance of accusation and guilt in order to do so. Legal reformers have been arguing for changes since at least the 1940s. The American Bar Association had committees. Law review articles accumulated. Sociologists who study the outcomes of divorce were writing about the inadequacy of the current system for the people most damaged by it. The particular problem that received the most sustained legal attention was the problem of women's economic vulnerability after divorce, the absence of reliable property claims, the inadequacy of alimony enforcement, the essentially precarious financial position of a woman who has spent years as a homemaker and found herself, after divorce, with no independent financial foundation. This was not an abstract problem. It was documented, specific, and producing measurable human suffering. The change, when it came in stages. California passed the first no-fault divorce law in the United States in 1969, allowing couples to divorce on the grounds of irreconcilable differences, without requiring either party to prove specific wrongdoing. It was, in retrospect, a legal revolution, the dismantling of a system that had been in place in one form or another for the entire history of American law. By the mid-1970s, most states had followed California's lead. The people who had been through divorce in the 1950s did not benefit from this reform. They had already navigated the old system, with all of its costs and its charades and its specific cruelties. But they had, in their aggregate experience of going through it, contributed to the pressure that eventually changed it. Their numbers, growing through the decade, visible enough to alarm the institutions that preferred not to see them, had made invisible an invisibility that could not be sustained. Their difficulties had been documented by the researchers and the reform advocates and the journalists who cared about what the system was actually doing to actual people. And the women who had rebuilt their lives in the apartments with the sticky car handles and the drawings on white walls had demonstrated, through the simple insistence of continuing to exist and to manage and to raise their children and to work their jobs and to be reasonably functional human beings in the face of a system that had not been designed to help them, they had demonstrated something that the 1950s preferred to doubt, that women were capable of the whole thing, the whole enormous, exhausting, complicated thing, on their own terms, without the legal and social infrastructure the era insisted they required. The 1950s were wrong about a great many things. On this one, the evidence was clear enough that even the decade could see it if it looked directly, which it mostly preferred not to, but the looking happened anyway. And what came after the looking was the beginning of a different world. It is late now. The story has come a long way from that 7:15 Tuesday morning kitchen with the percolator and the buttercup yellow walls. You have traveled through the legal machinery of a system that required personal failure to be performed in specific and often false terms. Through the 6 weeks in Reno with the mountains and the dry air and the horses and the boarding house women who had heard every story. Through the courtroom with the worn stone steps and the marble floors and the 15 minutes of testimony that ended something that had taken years to build. Through the neighbors with their casseroles and their careful smiles. Through the churches with their specific and sometimes unbending theologies. Through the apartments and the budgets and the jobs and the slow, difficult project of financial independence in a decade that had not designed its economic institutions to allow it. Through the children growing. Through the long middle and what it contained, through the second marriages and the ones who did not remarry, and the ones who found something else entirely, something the decade had not had a name for. Through all of it, the people, specific, ordinary, extraordinary people, women who cried at kitchen tables and men who made inadequate dinners alone in bachelor apartments and children who grew up with the quiet knowledge of being somewhat outside the world that television showed them every night before the test pattern arrived and the screen went dark. The 1950s is often remembered as a simpler time, and perhaps it was, in some ways, simpler in its certainties, simpler in its shared assumptions about what life was supposed to look like. But simplicity in the official story does not mean simplicity in the actual lives. It means, usually, that the complexity was somewhere other than the story's surface, living in the spaces between what was said and what was true. Divorce in 1950s America was one of those spaces. Hundreds of thousands of people a year moving through it, finding their way through a system that had not been designed for their comfort, emerging on the other side into lives that required them to build almost everything from beginning. They built it, not because the era gave them easy tools or a welcoming landscape. They built it because there was no other option, and because humans left to it generally do build things when the alternative is not building them. The buttercup yellow kitchen is still there, somewhere in a suburb of the city that has grown up around it in the decade since. The percolator is in a thrift store window or in a landfill or on a collector's shelf. The woman who stood at the stove on a Tuesday morning in 1953 and made a decision that changed everything. She went on to be someone. She is not a statistic. She is not a sociological category. She is a person whose specific and unrepeatable life intersected with a particular moment in American history, and who navigated it with the resources she had. That is worth knowing. That is worth sitting with quietly for a moment before you drift. The house is quiet now. Let it be quiet. The day is over. Let it be over. You are somewhere warm and safe, and the lights are low. Let them stay low. Whatever tomorrow requires of you, it can wait until tomorrow. For now, there is only this room, and this story ending gently, and the particular soft darkness that arrives when history finally puts down its weight and lets you rest. Good night. Sleep well. I will be here when you come back.